Your rights are my responsibility. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. And I'm not listening to your stupid classes.
Hello everyone, my name is Bill Roach and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today we're going to look at this really interesting topic. And we're going to look at this issue of, have you had people say, no, I do not want to discuss that because that is political. And you see people using this all of the time. And what I want to look at today is I want to ask this question. Has the notion of political become a new way to censor free speech? Can somebody just enter into a conversation and then exit the conversation and say, oh, no, that's merely political, therefore I don't have to engage in it. And we've all seen how this works. This works in a local church, it works in a family, it works in a social setting, it works really anywhere, where people today feel like they can bifurcate this little area known as politics, and somehow they can say, because of the social stigma around it, or the emotional trauma that one has around it, or the psychological difficulties that someone has around it, that they can just somehow stop discussing whatever issue it is today. So what I want to do is I want to make this apparent, and I want us to discuss this issue with the end goal of getting you to stop allowing people to socially manipulate you into what can be considered as appropriate speech. Because it's funny, it's not appropriate speech if it's political speech. It's not appropriate speech if it makes somebody feel anxiety or whatever term that they want to come up with here. And my point is that they use it as a means to hinder the development of thought, the expression of viewpoints, and ultimately free speech. So bringing this in just a little bit, what I want to do is, if you have experienced this, especially over the last several weeks and months, leave a comment below. Explain exactly kind of what happened with it, how you responded, and what the conversations were like afterwards. Because I can give you a whole host of stories where I've seen this recently, and I'll just give you a couple of them. I know we had this situation one time where I know of a pastor who was preaching about the whole Alistair Begg situation that was going on, where he said, you know, not only would he tell this person to go to the same-sex marriage, but he'd tell them to buy a gift for the grandchildren or whatever it was who were getting, quote, married at that particular event. And the pastor was talking about this, and he talked about how Begg was actually wrong about it. And this individual in a private setting, I remember sitting there, he got so angry about that. And this was afterwards and so forth. And he said, this man needs to stop bringing politics into the pulpit. And what's really interesting is that he doesn't want the pastor to speak on the issue of same-sex marriage and attending a same-sex marriage because it's politics. And that's another example of what I mean by people are using the concept of politics in order to just dismiss and use a form of cancel culture, or they're policing free speech in the lives of individuals because they don't feel comfortable talking about it. Or maybe it's because there's a situation in their life where they have a friend related to that particular thing and they don't really want to talk about it in that particular sense. My whole point is that people are doing this all the time. And I can think of other examples with people where, you know, you want to talk about this whole issue of, my goodness, you have the furries down at the school and they gave them a litter box. I can't believe my son and daughter's having to go and deal with that. Or the poor janitor that's having to clean the litter box afterwards. And you go, I can't discuss this. This is politics. So now with that said, I want you to recognize what this is doing is this is a social manipulation that's trying to hinder free speech, free thought, the development of thought, the discussion of ideas, and so forth. Now, there's one little clarification thing. I do recognize, and I am not saying it is wise to discuss all matters with all people, and that you should never just say, hey, bud, like, I really don't want to talk about this with you, because we recognize, like, there are people out there whom we would deem as foolish or do not answer a fool according to his folly. We need to have wisdom in the conversations that we have with one another. We need to have wisdom in the topics that we discuss in various places. We need to have wisdom on the things that we talk about in front of minors or children and so on and so forth. So nobody would be saying something along those lines. Like, obviously there's wisdom and there's prudence as it relates to those kinds of things. Rather, what I'm talking about is that when you're in an appropriate situation, usually with people that you trust, people are using this type of rhetoric or this sort of linguistic device in order to shut down all conversation with people to whom it would be appropriate to discuss these things, like the nature of marriage in front of a church, or whether or not it's right to have litter boxes with the furries at a local school or something like that. And like I said, we recognize that there are appropriate adult and children conversations. However, what we have to realize is that you can't take a truth that's in one area and use that as like a caveat in order to end dialogue in all other areas. We recognize that adults shouldn't hide real conversations from real people, but there's a place for, along the maturity as a person grows up and things go on in their life, that we can have age appropriate level conversations with them. But this is not what's happening. You're finding people who it's age appropriate, it's a valid topic, it's what the whole world's talking about, it's all over the media, but you won't talk about it because it's political speech. Now, one of the things that I want to look at here is that, we recognize the fact that people use the term or different terms to cancel free speech and thought all the time. So this is nothing new. People will say, well, I can't talk about that because it's racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobe, fill in the blank. And they just end conversation. And that's been sort of the modus operandi, the way that the left has worked on a whole host of issues. White people can't talk about this because it's racism. Men can't talk about that because it's the patriarchy in this sense. Or they're going to say, oh, that's just such an unloving topic to talk about. You cannot discuss that in front of us. Or that's just such a narrow viewpoint. We're above such things in the world. And, what's interesting is that the people who have sort of historically wanted to champion the concept of free speech and free dialogue and the ability to discuss issues and interact with ideas has historically kind of been the left in one sense. And now we recognize that that's always been a two-tiered kind of thing. Like in one arena, they want free speech, but in another arena, they really don't. But what's been really interesting is that this whole issue of politics, the concept of I can't talk about politics. And if you do, I either don't like you, I can separate from you, I can put stupid signs up against you, I can do all of these different things, has come out in full force over sort of this erotic, crazy, sort of critical queer theory and the sexual ethics, and ultimately with Trump and Trump derangement syndrome and all the things that come with this. So I found this really interesting video and I want to switch to it here. And it's very short, but it's with Victor Davis Hansen and whomever this individual may be here. And what I want to do is I want to play this and break it down just a little bit because I think it illustrates very well one aspect of how people do this as it relates to politics and as it relates to Trump. And then we're going to get into more sort of philosophical, theological issues and how to engage with this here in a minute. So here we go. Let's just watch this very, very quickly.
Let me tell you something, Victor.
Yeah.
I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris. Are you going to talk to me again?
In my family and in my circle of friends, I don't see the symmetrical anger from the conservative, from the left. When I see people in families and groups of friends that say they're going to vote for Trump, they don't get angry and say, I'm not going to speak to you if you don't vote for Trump. But I do see it asymmetrically.
I love my father. He told me.
So did you see exactly what he's saying here is that you have a lot of people out there that if you don't take the right political stance, they're never going to talk to you again. But what I'm saying is that there's another issue that relates to this is that what if you do want to talk about the validity of, say, a figure like Trump or the irrationality of the furries and all the rest that are out there? Well, people will say, I don't want to talk about this. That's with politics. And what's interesting is this is not just people that are, crazy progressives that are out there. These are conservatives who are doing this. These are people who are mothers. These are sisters. These are sister-in-laws. These are brother-in-laws. These are fathers, mothers, and so forth, who just shut down conversation because it makes them feel uncomfortable. And we're going to flesh that out a little bit more. But notice what this guy had to deal with here. This is talking about his father.
In the last election, if I vote for Trump, he's never speaking to me again. And I love him, but he said that, and that was really
intolerance
hurtful.
is all on the left because of this. They believe that their ends are morally superior, and therefore the means necessary to achieve them are justified. And if that means being acrimonious, rude, cutting people off, never talking to them, they will do.
Let me tell you something.
See that? The ends justify the means. My ends are, I don't want Trump in, I don't want people around, or whatever you may want in this sense. And so this figure is going to say, because I don't want Donald Trump in, I can treat you however I want. You could be a good neighbor to me for years on end, and I'm going to ridicule you and mock you and hate you. And parents will do this all the time. We all saw that crazy video that came out with the psychiatrist who was saying, if you have family members who voted for Trump, you don't even have to show up to the next holiday. You don't even have to talk to them, as they're creating, safe spaces and little puppy petting places on Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all the Ivy League institutions. And what's interesting is that coupled together, you see sort of this soft, intolerant, woke culture that just refuses to dialogue. And one of the ways that they do that is that they don't want to, quote, talk about politics. And this has embedded itself not only on the left, but into the right, where we're afraid to discuss things. And I would just really champion and say, I think we need to talk about the fully orbed concept of politics now, probably more than ever. And the reason is that our politics are absolutely insane now, because the foundations that undergird all of those issues related to politics, namely a metaphysic, an epistemology, an understanding of ethics. You notice there's a difference between values and ethics. I can value something, but that's different than saying this is absolutely morally right or this is absolutely morally wrong and all the rest. And I would say that people use this because, one, they're probably uninformed in like the grand scheme of those sorts of things, because as classical education and the classical learning has gone out and the understanding of the history ideas has gone by the wayside, people have lost the categories to discuss these things. And the issue is that people tend to think with their feelings instead of with their brains today. And I know some people are going to say, well, you can't think with your feelings. That's the whole point. They're just emotional and irrational. And like I've said, people have historically used this in other means, as mommy always said, when you meet with somebody, do not talk about religion and politics. And, they were considered divisive topics and so forth. So here's what I want us to look at a little bit more. We do recognize that there are certain topics that are deemed political and they are divisive, and no one denies that political issues are divisive. The bigger question is, why are they so divisive? And should you just refrain from talking about it because it's divisive? And, those go to a much deeper issue. Why is something divisive? Why is there a real divide between person A and person B on something? Is it a value judgment in the sense of like, I don't esteem this to be good? Is it a true moral judgment that's different? Excuse me. Is it a competing metaphysic? Is it competing epistemology? What is the root difference? And, if they are so divisive, how should we engage with them? And, like we've said, a lot of people tend to shut down conversations about marriage and moral issues and sexual religious questions and how religion should function in society just because they deem them as political. So if you can say, I don't want to talk about politics, or I don't want to talk about X because it's political, that is somehow used as a means to end any and all conversation. And we raise the question, should this be so? And what I want to do is I want to transition here to another little conversation that has taken place with a guy named John Benzinger. John is a guy with Redeemer Bible Church, and it's out in Gilbert, Arizona. In fact, it's somebody that we're working with in order to start a new seminary here soon, hint, hint, called Redeemer Seminary, and I will be helping with that. And he deals with this from the pulpit, and he deals with this whole issue of, well, is it really political? Now, this is diving more into like specifically with like Christians. Should a Christian just write something off because they deem it political? So let's play this here and listen to it, and we'll engage with it here in just a second, because I think he provides some very wise pastoral advice.
It's finally election week. I've talked a lot about what some people call politics. I've talked about it more than many Christians are used to, and if we're honest, more than many Christians would like. However, as I've said this whole time, much of what is called politics today is really theology and morality. And when that's what politics is, pastors should talk about it.
Did you hear about that? What a lot of people in the church today and in conservative circles today are trying to dismiss as politics is really theology and morality. Think about the whole issue of Alistair Begg. That's a true theological question that a pastor should address and is required to address because it's a fundamental theological thing that comes from the very pages of Scripture. In fact, it comes, as you're going to see here, from the first few chapters, even of the book of Genesis. It's a fundamental theological and moral issue, but people write it off as politics.
Christianity is not a private spirituality. Christianity is a worldview, a philosophy of life, a meta-narrative, an explanation, actually the explanation for everything. It is an explanation that is rooted in the character of God, in the activity of God, and rooted in what is plainly laid out in God's word, the Bible. Well, because of this, there are some truly obvious choices when it comes to this election. Obvious what to vote for, and even obvious who to vote for. And obvious, listen, if all you had was the first page of the Bible and nothing else. So let's try it. Genesis 1:1. God exists and created it all. But which party removed the mention of God from their platform and saw a large number of their delegates boo when God was added back to their platform by fiat? Still Genesis 1, verse 27. Which party is more likely to work against there being only two genders, male and female? Which party will more likely protect the classroom, the bathroom, the surgery room, and women's sports from the spread of radical gender ideology? Which party is more likely to protect parents' rights against this ideology? Still Genesis 1, verse 27 again. Which party is more likely to recognize and defend the image of God in human beings? Which one is supporting bills all over our country to legalize abortion up to birth right now? Which party had an abortion mill parked right outside of their convention? Which party is more likely to protect baby turtles on a beach instead of baby humans in the womb? Still Genesis 1, verse 27. Which party is more likely to foment ethnic hatred through critical social justice rather than the image of God, unity amongst all ethnicities? Which party is more likely to foment hatred for one's own gender and hatred between the genders rather than, again, image of God, unity amongst men and women? And as an aside, but still in Genesis, which party is more likely to support the enemies of God's chosen people, the Jews? You see, politics is never about perfection. That's impossible. It's always about what is most likely. By the way, based almost never on the words of any candidate, but instead based on their actions and the thousands of people they will appoint when they get into office. So which party, which candidate for really any office has enacted policies that are more in line with the Christian worldview on these issues and will appoint people who will do the same? Versus which party is most likely to enact policies that will be against the Christian worldview on these issues? I mean, is it even close? Honestly?
Could you see right now, people would say, I don't want to talk about that. That's politics. Is it political? No. What you're seeing is that there's the divide between the Christian worldview and all non-Christian worldviews. And he just laid that out in multiple examples. But what people will tend to do is that instead of thinking through a biblical Christian worldview, they write it all off as politics. This isn't something that we've just picked up from the left. This is something that's worked its way into the church and into conservative circles and into families and into multiple dialogues that people have on various issues all the time. Let's continue here. We only got just a little bit more.
Statistically, 1 in 3 people who identify as Christians refuse to vote at all. That is 12 to 15 million people in America and about 700 people here at Redeemer. Christian, if you haven't voted yet, please, this week, Tuesday, vote. If you've already voted, please help someone else go vote. Listen, if you want help voting, if you're not going to vote without someone helping you get to the polls, call the church office. We will find somebody. I've had numerous people stop me at the door and say, I'll do it. Just here's my phone number. We will get you to the polls. And when you vote, vote like someone who only has the first page of the Bible. And by the way, the rest of the Bible does not contradict the first page.
And also, I think what he's trying to get at is that if we only had the first page of the Bible, it's very, very clear when you walk in. Obviously, as a Christian, you have all the pages of the Bible. And I know John well enough that he would say, I completely agree that you need to take all of the pages of the Bible into consideration. But given the analogy and given that he limited it just to the first pages of the Bible, that comment sort of came from there. So I don't want somebody to be like, oh, we don't have all the Bible. And then you know how people get on the internet.
So vote for the protection of two genders. Vote for the protection of the image of God in the womb and the image of God among people. We've never once had a sinless candidate for any office. But despite that, you can still vote like a Christian who wants to see more of God's will coming from our government. And once we vote, we simply leave the results in the God's good and trustworthy hands. Now, we'll talk about these things and a lot more this Monday night in our live podcast. There'll be teaching, there'll be discussion.
So there's obviously a lot more that one could discuss with this. But what I want to do here is I want to kind of conclude with, well, how do we deal with this? Like a few reflections on this. So first of all, we recognize that it's happening. And if you fall and prey to it, stop doing it. Like clearly, very simple. But let's look at it a little bit more. And I think this is where we're going to go just a little bit more in depth as we discuss the particulars of this. So first of all, we need to, in this sense, demonstrate that political discussions reveal one's views on a variety of other essential topics: metaphysics, epistemology, the nature of law, education, virtue, vice, morality, etc. They are fundamental to the proper ordering of society, and to refrain from the dialogue is to bring disorder upon not only oneself, but society, and it ultimately harms society even more by not having the conversation. So what's happening is that God in his providence and God in his grace, and just the way that sort of this discussion has to operate is that you have usually the issue that people are discussing, but there are several other presuppositional issues, foundational issues, philosophical issues that undergird that. And sometimes for a variety of reasons, either because a person doesn't explicitly know, or they haven't thought about it, or there are real competing differences, such as how many people have a very well thought out metaphysic, epistemology, and notion of ethics that's worked out there. I'll be honest, I think very, very few people have. Like, as somebody who's been studying the history of ideas for most of my adult life and teaching them for several years now, I find most people are not only just naive, but almost ignorant as it comes to an explicit thing. And the part of that is, I lay the blame for it is that we just don't have the right kinds of conversations. People want to talk about football and the beach and baseball and all that kind of junk, to the neglect of the higher, bigger questions of life. And what happens is that if a person that you know is living like an unordered life, like their life is utterly chaotic, they're scattered to and fro, we recognize like that's not a person that I want to emulate. But what if our thoughts are scattered like that, and our ideas are scattered like that? We're no more disorganized if I'm running to and fro like a frantic person who can't get things together in a practical sense than when it comes to these bigger issues. Like, we're actually probably more disorganized, because as a man thinketh, so he is. So in today's world, what many fail to see is that refraining from these dialogues, or like the nature of this podcast, the timeless dialogues, they may continue, if they're not going to have those conversations, to hold to a false view out of fear or ignorance or neglect. truth should be triumphed in this regard. People should talk about these issues because truth matters. Ideas matter. How you order your life around those ideas matters. And one of the things that we find is that people need to be exposed to these conversations. They need to have these conversations because sometimes they need to think deeper about it. And I know that, when I was studying philosophy at a graduate level, there were a group of students that were in there and they would struggle because everybody struggles. These things are sometimes hard to grasp. And people kept saying, man, they're going over my head. They keep going over my head. And the professor then said, well, you just need to stand up so they get in your head instead of over your head. You need to engage in these issues. You need to read the books on these issues in order to start thinking about them properly. And I think what's happening is that there's a combination of the rhetoric and just lack of experience on them. I think the other thing that we need to look at is that if you look at the books that people are reading today, you have sort of secondary literature versus primary literature. And then you have almost like third order literature. And then you have whatever social media can turn into. Most people interpret what goes on through social media and various other things, but they never seem to get back to sort of the architects of the main ideas. And the great history of ideas, the great books of the history of ideas, frankly, are just a better conversation place and point to start from because you have better minds discussing the issues. And there's nothing wrong with saying you have not earned the right to speak on an issue as well as these great history of ideas figures. And there's a reason that they are the great history of ideas figures. One of the wonderful aspects of bringing the larger classical and philosophical issues and literature into the debate is that you realize that everything is usually downstream from some major thinker. We truly stand upon the shoulders of giants, either for our flourishing or for our demise. Or as it has been said, we are truly nothing more than a series of footnotes on Plato. And unfortunately, most of us don't actually have an understanding of the original idea, whether it be in Plato or one of those footnotes about a commentary, a detractor or an agreement or a modification of some key thinker in that regard. And, we even recognize that most people today, we recognize when you talk with them, they're just sort of emotional Marxists and postmodernists who haven't actually read the literature on either Marxist or postmodernists, but rather they are very emotional people who have just sort of picked up those ideas and they lack the rational capacity to discuss them and the emotional maturity to discuss them. So they just use what Marxist tactics do, can't talk about it, can't engage it, won't do it. Who can really know? Truth is subjective. Truth can't be known in order to refrain from the conversations. My point is that you got to realize that when you do that very type of sort of rhetorical device, you're actually using a very particular politic in order to stop talking about other people's politics. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more. I think another thing as it relates to the history of ideas, just a little footnote here is that yes, we can trace these things back to, this figure and that figure. Plato said this, or Aristotle said that, or Kant said this, or Marx said that, and all those different kinds of things like this. And that's nice. And that's very much a first step in understanding. You have to be able to summarize somebody's view. However, it's not good enough to just say, well, that's just Kantian, or that's just Marxist, or that's just Aristotelian, or whatever. Rather, what you have to do is you have to lay out what the views are and how those ideas were received and critiqued, and you must evaluate them upon the merits of their own strength or weakness. Because if it's just tracing an idea back to a guy, that's nothing more than a genetic fallacy. It's bad because it's him, or sort of the inverse of it. It's good because it's him. So you can say, oh, maybe this is good just because it came from Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle, and it's bad just because it came from Kant. No, you need to establish that Kant was bad on this and refute the idea, and you need to establish that Aquinas was good on this and establish the idea. That's how the evaluation of thought should take place, not just shut down in some regard. So my point is that we need to return back to the great classics of Western literature. It's not only a good way to have a good set of literature to discuss, but these are the great thinkers that shaped our society who frankly thought much deeper, and their ideas go much further than the superficial ways that we're doing this. Like, this is a way of growing up into maturity in the way that we think, and in the renewing of our minds. Like, as Christians, obviously that's what's done through the scriptures, but it's applying the scriptures to those key ideas that have shaped us in so many ways throughout the history of ideas in our lives. The next thing that I want to look at here is that people are going to discuss these matters, and it is better to serve as a guide or teacher to the group of people having the conversation than to just shut the conversation down altogether. So you're sitting around at a Thanksgiving table, people start talking about, oh, why did the pilgrims come here, and were they here? Is this really Thanksgiving just another Native American oppression day? Is this just something that we can use to squash the Indians? Well, how about you have a conversation about that versus being sort of I want everybody to get along. I don't want my turkey to be thrown at crazy Uncle Fred because he says that it's not an oppressive. You get my point. Why not be mature and help people think through these issues as a guide and as a teacher, instead of just stopping the conversation because it's political or because you have this idea of a magazine picture in your head of the perfect turkey or the perfect Christmas, and it doesn't meet up to that. Like, the goal here is not to just have the perfect Thanksgiving and the perfect Christmas. Rather, we're here to create mature individuals that function in society and in the family and in the church. So my point is that this guide, sort of teacher and, pastoral type of role, this has served as the basis for sort of like three different major roles in society. This dialogue where you guide somebody serves as the basis of sort of the professor-student relationship. That's how classrooms really function, is that the professor helps the students walk through these very difficult ideas with the hope of getting them to the end goal of seeing the lay of the land and becoming a better person because of it. This is also sort of the parent-child relationship. Parents have experienced more of life. They have more knowledge about life. And their goal is to lead people in this regard and in this way to serve as a guide and a teacher, not just on, hey, don't touch the stove because it's hot, or don't go over there because the dog bites. Maybe your role as a parent might be to say, hey, let's read through the Communist Manifesto. Let's understand what it said and how it affected the people that were under Marx, and then how it was picked up in China and how it was spread to different countries and communism and all the different things that came from it. And what is the relationship between communism and socialism and fascism and all these other isms and schisms, so that you can teach your children how to actually live in this world versus just pay bills in this world and play sports in high school. Maybe there's something more that needs to take place there. In addition to this, I think that there's another role where we see this take place, and that's sort of in the relationship between the pastor and his congregation, where the pastor helps people think through a whole assortment of the topics that the Bible talks about, but also how do those things engage in the society in which we live? And if a pastor just shuts down conversation because we can't talk about politics, when we know most issues of politics, virtually all issues of politics, are about what is real, how do we know that which is real, how do we know that which is good, how do we know that which is virtuous, how do we know that which is a vice, how do we know that which is evil, and how do we replicate that into society in that regard? We realize those are fundamental philosophical and theological and practical issues that we need to be discussing, not just dismissing as they are politics. And my point is that failure to discuss these types of matters in these types of relationships is a dereliction of duty as it pertains to the state, the family, the church, and the classroom in all of these regards. We need to see that we are called to live up to a certain standard. And when we fail to live up to that standard because of some vain rhetorical device that people are using today, from really just emotionally immature people that lack the ability to discuss them, it's a dereliction of our duty. Just like it's a dereliction of a duty for a parent to not tell a kid, don't touch the stove because it's hot. I think it's a dereliction of duty to shut down conversations and to not have conversations in various spheres and avenues of your life out of fear of politics or division, or we don't talk about politics and religion here, move on kind of thing. So ridiculous. Failure in this regard is to utterly snub the entire Western tradition of open and public discussion on these matters. People gave their lives in order for there to be the freedom of speech. And you have a group of people that just come in because, oh, I can't handle it. It's too hard. It's political. Oh, it's so hot in here. Get me my fan. Come on, guys. People gave their lives so that soy boy latte drinking fools out there and individuals like that and these sort of emotionally immature snowflakes can't just shut down a conversation. And in fact, if you want to know anything that I think what was revealed in this last sort of election that we had is that you have one group, the progressive left, that wants to shut down free speech. And they keep saying things like, you know, we need to have a figure like Joe Rogan on the left. Well, Joe Rogan used to be your figure on the left until you tried to shut down free speech. And then he said, nope, I'm joining the party of free speech. And I'm going to use a mechanism of free speech, namely X/Twitter. And you got Elon Musk and all these others. And that's why this whole issue of freedom of speech is so pivotal, not only to this, the flourishing of ideas, but to the whole tradition of Western philosophy and the communication of ideas and the debating of ideas for the betterment of our society. And anything less than that is really to snub your ancestors in that regard. So what we have to find is that we must recognize that there is a responsibility to educate the essential humanity of ourselves and society in these key kind of areas. And by that I mean is that all men by nature want to know the truth and the good and to order their lives around the truth and the good, but something gets in place from this, either a lack of knowledge or from the Christian worldview. It's not just a lack of knowledge, it's sin that goes in and affects our thinking and our will and our emotions. And what we need to do is we need to take it upon ourselves to disciple people and to, as I said, educate the essential humanity of ourselves. And the great history of ideas and the great books ought to be required reading. And certain people should be required to sit through what may be deemed and may feel like uncomfortable conversations, because we are all like children in this regard. And we need, excuse me, and we need the parents of these historic thinkers or these historic thinkers who are going to function as parents to teach us, to discipline us, and to encourage us towards the best things in life. And here's another thing. If you don't like that, if you don't like making people think through this, or you don't want people having these conversations, remember this. When you tell me to not discuss these matters, you are ultimately, one, telling me what is the best good in my life. The best good is not to discuss them. And two, instructing me about that supposed greatest good. You know, it's probably best if you didn't discuss these things. And three, you're disciplining me both personally and socially in that regard by shun or embarrassment or screaming or whatever. My point is that you're going to put forward your greatest good and you're going to try to educate people about your greatest good. And you're going to try to discipline people upon that which is your greatest good. And you're going to react to that which you think is the greatest good, whether you like it or not. Consistency is a test for truth. If you really did this, you would say nothing at all instead of trying to force it upon somebody. See my point? Here's another thing. Two more. I know we're quickly getting done here. So we ultimately need to recognize that saying, I don't want to discuss this because it is political is a way of forcing your views upon society, family, and the church. Now, like we said, we recognize that all things should be discussed at all times. We recognize that. We dealt with that already. My point is that if your political axiom is that no one should discuss their political axioms, you're fundamentally discussing your political axiom. You're fundamentally applying that political axiom to all people. You're fundamentally publicly applying that axiom to people, and you're expecting people to bend their knee to your political axiom. You allow no detractors, and in essence, you want out of the text chain, or you want to leave the setting, or you don't want to be around this because you want everybody to coddle you according to your political axioms. So why can't other people do that? Because you don't really believe in free speech. So you take your ball and you go home. It's true. It's how people act. That's what they do. We know it. We've seen it. My point is that you're putting forth a political axiom while you're telling everybody else not to. Sorry, you don't have the privilege to do that in a free society. And finally, what we have to see here is that when people use this type of rhetoric, we must recognize them for what they are. They're manipulations of various situations. They want life to be the way that they want it to be, and they'll twist and turn it however they want it in order to get what they want. And they'll just call it politics because they just don't like talking about it. Historically, this is how totalitarian groups taught people to handle opposing viewpoints. This was a key tactic for Mao's methods throughout China. These are, just to be absolutely honest, these are struggle sessions, and people fall for it all the time. You need to say, like, I know what I'm talking about. I know what I see. I know that manipulation doesn't work on me, and we're going to keep talking about this. I'm not going to allow your emotion to determine what I talk about. I'm sorry. If you don't like that, go home. Go somewhere else. In this house and in this place, we talk about ideas. And what we have to find is that this is just something that's radically contrary to the notion of freedom of speech, period. Freedom of speech matters in this regard. So here's a few solutions very quickly. You need to point out the manipulation as it's taking place. Like literally, you need to say, like, do you know what you're doing? You're calling it politics in order to shut down conversation. Like that kills free speech and all the rest. Let the person know that you're still going to continue to discuss the issue, even if they don't feel comfortable about it, because comfort isn't a test for truth or morality, or really for anything. Oh, I feel comfortable about this, so it must feel good and it must be right. That's what's true. Sorry, feelings don't determine anything. Feelings don't determine an is, they don't determine a no, like K-N-O-W, like they don't determine what is, they don't determine what I know, they don't determine an ought concerning any situation. So just because you don't feel like talking about it and you label it as political, that doesn't work. That manipulation is going to kind of get stopped right there. And it's your goal, it's really your responsibility to call it for what it is, stop the manipulation in its place, and correct it. I think another thing is that, you know, we always talk about how we want to have conversations with people and nobody ever wants to have conversations. Well, find a group of people that are willing to have these kind of conversations with you that allow for an environment of free speech. Invite people into that type of environment. You know, what I think you can do is you can model it well, show it well, tell people like we don't have cry sessions and puppy petting play areas. That's really hard to say. We know that stuff can be where you can have the given good nature today of friendly dialogue, you know. And what I have to say is that, you know, given the nature of the public school system from kindergarten through 12th grade into college, into graduate school and beyond, like people aren't taught how to do this. They honestly have no clue how to have adult conversations in this regard. So we as conservatives or as people who believe in free speech or as people who believe in the history of Western ideas or people within the church, we need to model it for them. And not only model it, but equip people to do it. Like it's going to take a lot of work, but we can train people how to do this by discipling them, teaching them, educating them, and much, much more. So with that said, I want to just finalize this whole thing and conclude by saying, are we living in a situation today where people say, I can refrain from a conversation because it's political speech? Yes, clearly. And people will label it as political when it's really something that's philosophical, theological, and so on and so forth. So the goal is I want you to ultimately stop falling for this. So if you've made it this far, please comment below and give a few comments and illustrations about how you could try to, you know, engage this and deal with people on this, but also share this. Share this with 5 of your friends who you think one may agree or disagree with this, and ask them to do the very same thing. Because this is how sort of like the snowball of the great history of ideas is brought into the current context. Like this is a goal of mine. This is why we call this whole thing timeless dialogues, so that we can have these very key, these very essential timeless dialogues. Again, thank you. Appreciate it.